The penthouse stood like a silent monument above Manhattan, a tower of glass and steel that caught the city's restless light but never let it in. Behind its heavy curtains, time seemed to pause. The walls were white and polished, the floors so reflective they almost looked wet, but there was no warmth in their perfection. Everything had been arranged for efficiency, every corner softened, every edge padded, every hallway cleared of obstacles. Yet the space felt cold, as though life had been drained from it years ago. Alexander Ward sat alone in the study, the city's skyline pressing against the glass behind him. At 48, he was a man who had conquered the world. His company's software powered governments, banks, and corporations. He was praised in glossy magazines, feared in boardrooms, envied in whispered conversations. His net worth had climbed into the billions. To the outside world, he was untouchable. But in this house, in this silent prison he called home, Alexander was just a man who had failed at the one thing he couldn't buy, giving his children light. Upstairs, muffled sobs floated through the ceiling, fragile and haunting. They came like rainfall, soft, steady, and impossible to ignore. He didn't need to check. He knew it was Daniel and David, 7 years old, born into absolute darkness. They had never seen their father's face, never watched the sunrise spill gold over Central Park, never traced the blue of a clear sky with their eyes. Their world was a void, and no amount of money could change that. Alexander had tried. God knows he had tried. He had flown in specialists from Boston, Paris, London. He had paid for machines that cost more than houses, surgeries that cut into hope as much as flesh, therapies that left the boys exhausted but unchanged. $15 million gone, and all he had were binders filled with diagnoses and letters stamped, "No further treatment recommended." Every failure had carved something deeper into him. His wife, Elise, had died on the delivery table the day the twins were born. 2 lives given, 1 life lost. People said time healed. But Alexander had lived 7 years in a silence that only grew heavier, a silence that mocked the sound of her laughter that once filled these rooms. Now all he had were his son's cries and the faint echoes of what had been taken from him. He rose from the leather chair and walked across the study, his footsteps echoing in the marble. The curtains along the balcony doors were shut tight, as they always were. Light was considered dangerous here, a cruel invader. Doctors had said it could harm the boys' sensitive eyes, even if they could not truly see. And so, Alexander had sealed his home like a cave, trapping his children in safety that felt more like a sentence. He touched the edge of the curtain with his fingertips, paused, then let it fall back. What good was light if it only brought pain? What good was wealth if it couldn't buy sight? He poured a glass of whiskey, his evening ritual, though it did nothing to dull the ache inside. As the burn hit his throat, his phone vibrated with a reminder. Another meeting, another deal to close. He muted it without glancing. Tonight, even his empire felt meaningless. From above, the sobbing shifted into a faint whimper, then silence. For a moment, Alexander closed his eyes and imagined he could hear laughter instead, but the house had forgotten that sound long ago. The intercom buzzed suddenly, breaking the stillness. Security announced that an applicant had arrived for a housekeeping position. A trivial matter, Alexander thought. One more cog in the machine of this house that ran like a sterile clock. Yet as he straightened his suit jacket and prepared to descend the stairs, he felt an odd, almost imperceptible tremor in his chest. He didn't know it yet, but when he stepped into that grand marble hall, the course of his life and the fate of his children was about to shift forever. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, spilling a ribbon of light across the marble floor of the grand hall. Alexander descended the curved staircase slowly, one hand resting on the polished mahogany rail, the other clenched tight against his side. His footsteps echoed with the kind of authority that filled boardrooms and made men fold under pressure. But tonight, in his own home, his stride carried no triumph. He was simply a father walking through a house that felt colder than the skyscraper outside. At the base of the stairs, the applicant stood waiting. Isabella Carter, a black woman in her early 30s, dressed simply in a crisp white shirt and dark jeans. Her sneakers were worn but scrubbed spotless, as if she had spent the night polishing them to prove herself. In her hands she carried not a handbag but a neatly packed tool bag, the kind more common for repair workers than housemaids. She stood tall, her posture neither submissive nor arrogant, but steady, like someone used to storms and unwilling to bow to them. The security guard at the desk had already tried to send her to the service entrance. The words hung in the air like smoke. The back is that way. Procedural, yes, but sharp in its undertone, as if her presence had already violated the order of this house. Isabella hadn't flinched. Instead, she had lifted her chin slightly and said with quiet certainty, "I have an appointment with Mr. Ward." Now, in the silence of the hall, Alexander studied her carefully. His eyes, sharp from years of negotiations, searched for weakness. Most applicants came in timid, hands fidgeting, eyes darting across the chandeliers and oil paintings as though the house itself judged them. Isabella did not. Her gaze met his with a calm steadiness that unnerved him for reasons he couldn't name. "Miss Carter," Alexander said, his voice clipped, the tone of a man who had no time for wasted words. "Thank you for coming." They shook hands. Her palm was warm, her grip firm, not the delicate, tentative shake he expected. She smelled faintly of soap and citrus, a clean honesty that contrasted with the cold polish of his penthouse. He opened the folder Celia, the house manager, had prepared and flipped through the resume. Years of domestic work, some caregiving experience. But what caught his attention were the blank spaces, periods unaccounted for, jobs not listed. He had learned long ago that blank spaces often hid the real story. 3 floors, 12 bedrooms, a library, 2 offices, he said evenly, scanning the pages. "The salary is $3,000 a week, weekends off. There is only one condition." His eyes lifted, locking on hers. "Do not interfere with my children's therapy schedule. I will not allow anyone to plant hope only to break it again." The last words fell like stones in the hall. His voice softened just slightly, almost a whisper, as if even he feared their weight. Isabella drew in a slow breath before answering. Her face didn't falter, but her eyes flickered with something, pain perhaps, or memory. "I don't promise what I can't be sure of," she said, her tone low but steady. "I'll do my job, Mr. Ward, and I'll respect your family's pain." From above, a sound drifted down, 2 muffled sobs, overlapping, fragile and exhausted. Daniel and David again. It was a sound that cut sharper than any blade. Alexander's shoulders tightened, his jaw locked. Even now, after 7 years, he couldn't bear how helpless it made him feel. For the first time, Isabella's calm wavered. Her eyes rose toward the ceiling, and something in her chest seemed to clench. She knew that sound. It was the same kind she had once heard from her younger brother when the world felt like an endless wall of night. That memory still lived in her like an open wound. Alexander closed the folder with a snap. "You can start tomorrow morning," he said. As she walked down the hallway, Celia guided her toward the staff quarters. The older woman whispered, "Mr. Ward is punctual. He likes things a certain way. This house has rules." Rules. Isabella nodded politely, but her eyes roamed the walls padded for safety, the corners softened, the curtains sealed tight. Every detail screamed of a house optimized for blindness. Yet what struck her hardest was the absence of light, not a crack, not a shimmer, a fortress built to keep the world out. Behind her, Martha, the nanny, appeared in her uniform, lips curled in a thin smile as she glanced at the tool bag. "We keep things a certain way here," she said, the implication heavy. "Don't change anything, especially not you." Isabella returned the smile, but her silence spoke louder than words. She had heard those tones before, in Brooklyn, in every house where she was the help. But she had also made herself a promise long ago. If she was ever given the chance, she would not let another child live only in tears. That night, in her small room, she unpacked her things. From a wooden box, she pulled out old notes scribbled years ago while caring for her brother, a tiny flashlight, a set of black and white contrast cards, a clicking toy top. She lined them carefully, as if arranging weapons before battle. New York was a city of light, always finding cracks in walls and slipping through. And as Isabella closed her eyes, she whispered to herself the vow she carried like breath. "If there's a way to push light through this house, I will find it." She didn't know yet how quickly the chance would come. Upstairs, Daniel and David rocked themselves to sleep in darkness. Tomorrow morning, their world would shift forever, beginning not with a doctor, not with $1 million machine, but with a woman carrying a notebook and a heart that refused to stop listening. The morning began like every other in Alexander Ward's penthouse, silent, efficient, suffocating. The city below was alive with horns and footsteps, but inside these walls, time seemed sealed off. The curtains stayed drawn, the air too still, as though even the house itself held its breath. Isabella rose before dawn. She pressed her shirt carefully, tied her hair back, and slipped the worn tool bag over her shoulder. The bag looked out of place in the gleaming kitchen when she set it down, like a relic from another world. Celia, the house manager, greeted her with a polite nod, already brewing coffee. "Mr. Ward likes precision," she murmured, her voice soft but firm. "Everything has its place here. You'll see." Isabella only smiled faintly. She had learned long ago that houses with too many rules often had wounds buried beneath them. Alexander appeared briefly, striding past with a phone pressed to his ear. His navy suit was immaculate, his expression already carved from stone. Yet even as he spoke numbers and strategy, he gave her the smallest of nods, a signal that she was no longer invisible. Then he was gone, carried by another call. Isabella gathered her cleaning supplies. She repeated the rule in her mind. Do not interfere with the children's therapy. She intended to honor it, but as she moved through the hallway, her steps slowed. From upstairs, she heard the faint sound again, the one that had gripped her chest the night before. 2 boys crying, muffled and rhythmic, like rain falling on glass. Something inside her shifted. She told herself to keep walking, to polish the silver, to stay in her lane, yet her feet betrayed her, pulled as though by invisible strings toward the family room. The door stood slightly ajar. She peered in. 2 oversized armchairs sat side by side, cradling 2 small figures curled into themselves, Daniel and David. The twins rocked back and forth in unison, their arms wrapped tight around their knees, their movements a desperate rhythm of self-comfort. Their sobs were soft, but they filled the room with a weight that pressed against the walls. On the opposite side, Martha, the nanny, sat with her eyes glued to the blue glow of a tablet. She didn't look up. Her voice drifted, flat, mechanical. "Stop crying. You know it won't change anything." No step toward them. No hand on their shoulders. Nothing. Isabella's heart clenched. She had seen neglect before, the quiet kind that left no bruises but scarred all the same. Her hand tightened around the spray bottle she carried. She took one careful step inside. The sound of the spray hissed through the air, sharp, clean, like glass breaking. Both boys lifted their heads instantly, faces turning toward the sound with uncanny precision. Isabella froze. Their sobs halted. She lowered her voice to a whisper, speaking as if to shadows. "Hello there," she said softly. "I'm Isabella. I came to make this room clean and fresh." Daniel's head tilted, his face sharp with awareness. Where's Martha?" His voice was small but searching. "She'll be right back," Isabella said gently. "Do you want to help me listen to the sounds?" She squeezed the bottle again. A tiny giggle slipped from David, unguarded and bright. Daniel tapped his fingers against the arm of his chair, matching the rhythm of her spray. Tap, tap. Isabella's chest swelled. Laughter, fragile, fleeting, but real, echoed in a house that had forgotten it. She stepped further in, her movements slow, deliberate. She tapped the wooden table 3 times. Tap, tap, tap. Then she stopped, waiting. Daniel listened, then tapped back twice. Tap, tap. David clapped his hands. "You." Mildly offbeat but joyful, then adjusted to the rhythm following her. Isabella moved around the room, tapping from different places. Near the window, Daniel's head tilted right. Near the bookshelf, David turned left. Their bodies leaned instinctively toward her as if they were tiny saplings reaching for sunlight. It wasn't sight, not yet, but it was awareness, precision, curiosity. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. This was more than sound. This was trust beginning to bloom. She lowered herself to their level, speaking softly. "You're very good at listening. Better than most grown-ups I know." Daniel's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. "It's our game. We hear things." David added, his voice trembling with excitement. "You made it fun." Isabella's eyes burned, but she didn't let tears fall. She swallowed hard, her chest heavy with memory. She had once played these same games with her younger brother, long before an accident stole him away. Now, sitting before these two boys, it felt as though the past had found a way to live again, this time with a chance to change the ending. Her gaze flickered to the heavy curtains, drawn tight as though light itself were an enemy. A thought sparked inside her, dangerous but unstoppable. What if the doctors were wrong? What if this darkness wasn't absolute? But she held it back. Not yet. For now, she gave them rhythm. For now, she gave them sound. She smiled at them, steady and warm. "Shall we play again tomorrow?" Both boys nodded eagerly, their faces brighter than the sealed room allowed. From the doorway, Martha's shadow loomed, her expression sharp, suspicion written across every line. But for the first time in 7 years, Daniel and David's sobs had turned into laughter, and that tiny shift had already cracked the silence of the house. The next morning, the house breathed its same heavy silence. Curtains sealed, air filtered, footsteps hushed. The world outside was a blaze of summer light, but within Alexander Ward's penthouse, it remained a cavern of muted shadows. Isabella moved through the rooms quietly, her cloth gliding across glass surfaces that reflected nothing but darkness. The sound of laughter lingered in her mind from the day before, a rare, trembling laughter from Daniel and David. It had been faint, but real enough to cling to her like perfume. Even as she scrubbed the banister or polished the silver, she kept replaying the image of their small faces lifting toward the sound of her spray bottle, their tiny hands clapping in rhythm. In those moments, they had seemed less like broken children and more like boys with possibilities. She carried her tool bag again, though she had no reason to bring it. Inside it lay her brother's old relics, black and white contrast cards, a flashlight, scraps of notes scribbled years ago. She had once believed she'd never open that box again. It hurt too much. But now it seemed to whisper from the corner of her small staff room, "Try again. Don't let them grow up in silence." By mid-morning, she found herself drifting back to the family room. The twins were there, curled on their oversized armchairs, rocking themselves as they always did. Their world was small, measured in touch, in echoes, in the rhythm of their own breathing. Martha sat at the far end, phone in hand, scrolling as though the children's presence demanded nothing of her. Isabella stepped in softly. "Hello, Daniel." "Hello, David," she whispered. Two heads lifted, two faces turned toward her voice with astonishing accuracy. "Do you want to play the sound game again?" "Yes," David said, his voice breathless with eagerness. "Okay." Isabella tapped on the table. Tap, tap. She shifted and tapped. On the bookshelf. The boys tilted their heads, their bodies leaning toward her as though searching for her shadow. Their smiles spread, tentative but glowing. And then Isabella's eyes drifted to the curtains. They loomed heavy, thick velvet drowning the windows, pressing out every hint of morning. She hesitated. Her pulse quickened. She remembered Alexander's warning. "Do not interfere with my children's therapy schedule. Don't plant false hope." She could hear those words as if he stood behind her now, watching, waiting to pounce if she dared break the rule. But she also remembered her brother, how he used to tilt his head toward a lamp even if the doctors insisted he could see nothing, how he whispered once, "I think I see brightness," before the accident stole his chance forever. Isabella's hand trembled as it touched the edge of the curtain. She whispered to the boys, "I want to try something. If it feels wrong, if it hurts, you just say one word. Stop." Daniel and David straightened, sensing her seriousness. Their small faces turned toward her, not in fear, but in readiness. She pinched the fabric with both hands, pulled gently, and snap. A slit opened. A thin thread of light cut across the carpet, lying still like a golden blade. For a second, Isabella could barely breathe. Then it happened. Both boys turned their faces toward it instantly. Their chests rose, sharp and startled. Not cries of pain, not recoils of fear, just stillness, as if they had found something they had never known existed, but had always longed for. "It's different," Daniel murmured, voice trembling. "It's brighter," David whispered, his small hands tightening on the armrest. Isabella moved slowly, stepping into the beam so that her shadow split the light. "It's darker now," Daniel said without hesitation. David gasped softly. "Someone walked between us and something." Isabella, his throat tightened, tears pressed behind her eyes, but she forced them back. She couldn't cry now, not now. She closed the slit quickly, returning the curtain to its prison state. The light vanished. The room fell dim again. She crouched in front of the boys, took their hands in hers, and spoke gently. "That's enough for today. You did so well, so well." "But I want to know more," David whispered, breathless. "You will," Isabella said softly, squeezing their hands. "But slow, always slow, and safe." The boys nodded, their expressions lit not by sight but by something new. Hope. At that moment the door opened sharply. Martha stood in the doorway, eyes narrowing as she spotted Isabella kneeling by the twins. Her voice cut the air like a knife. "What do you think you're doing? Your job is cleaning." Daniel's head snapped up. "Martha," he said, his voice urgent. The light didn't hurt. Martha froze, her face blanching. David added almost proudly, "Miss Isabella made a tiny line of light. We could tell when it was brighter and darker." Silence slammed down. Isabella rose slowly, her expression calm but steady. "I created a very small, safe test," she said, her voice level. "The boys could stop any time." Martha's eyes flared. "You had no right." But from behind her, hurried footsteps echoed down the stairs. Alexander Ward appeared in the doorway, tie loosened, face pale. His eyes darted from Isabella to his sons, then froze. He had heard the words. Light, brighter, darker. His voice cracked as he whispered, "What is happening here?" Alexander Ward stood in the doorway as if the ground had opened beneath him. His sons, his fragile, blind boys, sat upright in their chairs, their faces alive with an energy he had never seen. The word light still echoed in the air, trembling like glass on the verge of shattering. For 7 years he had buried that word, forced himself never to whisper it in their presence. The doctors had warned him, light would do nothing but wound. And yet here it was, spoken freely from the mouths of children who had known nothing but darkness. Daniel's small voice reached him first. "Dad, I can tell when it's brighter." Then David, more urgent, bursting out before silence swallowed him. "I can feel when it gets darker too. Miss Isabella showed us." Alexander's throat tightened. For a moment, he couldn't speak. His hand went instinctively to his mouth, as if to keep in the sob that threatened to escape. He stepped into the room slowly, each stride heavier than the last. His gaze locked on Isabella, who still stood by the curtain, her hands steady at her sides, though her chest rose and fell with sharp breaths. "What exactly did you do?" His voice was low, measured, but beneath it trembled something dangerous. Fear, hope, disbelief all colliding at once. "I opened the curtain," Isabella replied calmly. "Just a slit, a single thread of light across the floor. The boys turned their faces to it. They responded when I blocked it. They knew the difference." Martha snapped before Alexander could respond, her words laced with venom. "She had no right, Mr. Ward. This is reckless, dangerous." Dr. Collins said, "Enough." Alexander's voice cut through like a blade. He turned, his eyes falling on his sons. He knelt before them, lowering himself until his face was level with theirs. His navy suit bunched awkwardly, but he didn't care. "Did it hurt?" His voice broke on the last word. Both boys shook their heads. Daniel whispered, "No, Dad. It didn't hurt. It was just different," David added, his small hands gripping the armrest with excitement. "We could feel it, like someone touched the room." Alexander's breath caught. His hands trembled as he reached for them, gripping their tiny fingers in his. His heart hammered so loudly he could barely hear himself think. Could it be? After years of hopeless diagnoses, Leon spent endless nights staring at sealed windows. Could it be true? He looked back at Isabella, his voice cracked with a mixture of awe and terror. Do it again, exactly as before. I need to see it. Isabella hesitated. Her gaze flickered to the boys. Only if they want to, she said softly. Daniel squeezed her hand. Okay. David nodded, his voice firm. Yes. Isabella moved toward the curtain again, her fingers curling into the thick velvet fabric. She pinched it open just as before, an inch, no more. A narrow beam spilled across the carpet. Both boys turned instantly, their faces lifted toward it, eyes clouded but alive, their bodies tilting forward as if pulled by gravity itself. Isabella stepped into the beam, letting her shadow break it. It's darker, Daniel said without pause. Someone's in the way, David added, a small smile breaking across his face. Alexander's hands flew to his mouth. His knees buckled slightly. For the first time in years, tears broke free and rolled down his face unchecked. The man who had commanded empires, who had stared down billion-dollar boardrooms, now wept like a child before his own sons. My God, he whispered hoarsely. My God. Martha's face drained of color. She clutched her phone, her thumb already pressing against the screen. I'm calling Dr. Collins. This isn't in the plan. But Alexander spun on her, his voice shaking with fury and something close to joy. Plans. I've lived by your plans for 7 years, and what have they given me? Nothing but silence and sobs. For the first time in their lives, my boys turned their faces toward the sun. The room held its breath. Celia, drawn by the commotion, rushed in from the kitchen, her hand flying to her chest as she took in the scene, the beam of light, the boys leaning toward it, Alexander kneeling with tears streaming down his face. Isabella closed the curtain gently, returning the room to its dim cocoon. She crouched beside the boys, her voice steady though her eyes glistened. That's enough for today. We'll go slow, always slow. The twins nodded, their small fingers still clutching at hope as though afraid it might slip away. Alexander rose, his face wet but unashamed. His eyes locked on Isabella, no longer cold, no longer distant, but burning with raw emotion. You just did what $15 million and the best doctors in the world could not. His voice broke again. You gave me a reason to believe. And though he didn't know it yet, those words marked the beginning of a war against prejudice, arrogance, and every voice that had told him his children's world would remain forever dark. The days that followed felt like a storm crouched on the horizon. The penthouse, once suffocating in silence, now carried a strange, fragile hum of possibility. The twins whispered about brighter and darker like secret words they had just learned. Isabella kept her notebook close, logging every detail, the angle of the slit, the time of day, the twins' exact words. Alexander, still reeling from the miracle, spent hours pacing the study at night, staring at the curtains as though they were both enemy and savior. But not everyone welcomed the change. On the third morning, Martha returned from her call with Dr. Collins, the family's longtime specialist, her lips pressed into a thin line. She moved through the halls with the satisfaction of someone who believed she had summoned reinforcements. By noon, the intercom buzzed. Security announced a visitor, Dr. Henry Collins himself. Collins was a tall man with silver hair, an expensive suit, and eyes like polished glass. He carried the air of someone who had dined with senators and lectured to rooms filled with lesser minds. When he stepped into the marble foyer, even the chandelier's light seemed to bow away from him. Mr. Ward, Collins greeted smoothly, his voice warm but calculated. I came as soon as I heard. Alexander met him with a tight jaw. I didn't call you? No, Collins said, glancing briefly at Martha, but I was told of certain developments. His eyes flicked to Isabella, who stood quietly at the edge of the room, her tool bag at her side like a shield. His smile thinned. A maid experimenting on children? Forgive me, but that is beyond reckless. Isabella didn't flinch. She met his gaze steadily, her voice calm. I didn't experiment. I listened. I created a safe condition, and the boys responded. Collins waved a dismissive hand as though brushing away a fly. Children with cortical blindness often exhibit random head movements. What you mistook for vision was nothing more than chance. False hope, miss. He paused, letting the word twist with condescension. Carter is more dangerous than blindness itself. Alexander's fists clenched at his sides. I saw them turn. I saw them respond to shadows. That wasn't random. Collins' smile cooled into something sharp. Grief can make men see what they want to see. He shifted his gaze back to Isabella, his tone hardening. And women like her. Well, with no medical training, no license, shouldn't be allowed near such fragile cases. The words hung in the air, ugly and heavy. Isabella's chest tightened, but her voice didn't waver. Titles don't change what the children felt. They knew the difference between light and dark. That was real. Collins leaned closer to Alexander, lowering his voice to a confidential murmur, though every syllable carried like a blade. If you allow this to continue, I'll have no choice but to inform the medical board. They take these matters very seriously. Child Protective Services could become involved. Do you want your sons ripped from your care because a maid decided to play doctor? The threat struck like a thunderclap. Celia gasped softly. Martha crossed her arms, smugness flickering in her eyes. Alexander stared at Collins, torn between. In the authority of a man he had trusted for years and the truth he had witnessed with his own eyes. His empire had taught him to respect credentials, to measure everything by power and reputation. But nothing in Collins' polished tone could erase the memory of Daniel whispering, "Dad, I can tell when it's brighter." Finally, Alexander spoke, his voice low but steady. I won't ignore what I saw. For the first time in 7 years, my children showed me something no report ever could. Collins's expression darkened. Then you're choosing to gamble with their safety. He turned sharply, his coat sweeping behind him. I'll be in touch with the board. The heavy doors closed, leaving the house colder than before. Silence pressed down, broken only by the faint sound of the twins laughing softly upstairs. Isabella looked at Alexander. He'll come after us. You know that. Alexander exhaled slowly, his face lined with both fear and resolve. Then we'll give him something he can't dismiss. Evidence. He turned to her, eyes fierce now. From this moment forward, we don't just open curtains. We build a case. We'll record, document, measure. We'll fight with proof. For the first time, Isabella allowed herself a small, tired smile. Data doesn't care about prejudice, she said quietly. It just speaks. And though the war had only begun, a new rhythm took root in the house that day. The rhythm of science, of hope stitched carefully into evidence, of a father and a maid preparing to stand against an empire. But outside, in offices lined with diplomas and power, Collins was already sharpening his knives. The next morning dawned pale and golden over Manhattan, but the Ward penthouse remained sealed in shadow. The curtains stayed drawn, the world outside muffled into silence. Yet within those walls, something had shifted. The house that once groaned under despair now pulsed, with a fragile rhythm, a rhythm born not of money or machines, but of two small boys whispering the word light. Isabella rose earlier than the staff. She brewed a pot of tea in the kitchen, then carried her tool bag into the family room. Today she was no longer only a maid with cleaning supplies. Today she was a recorder, a witness, a scientist without a degree. She spread her notebook across the polished table, her handwriting neat, measured, date, time, location. She created columns, stimulus, response, latency, anxiety level. Each line was a vow that no one could call their progress chance or imagination. When Daniel and David padded into the room, still in their cotton pajamas, their heads tilted toward her instantly. They had begun to recognize her footsteps, the subtle click of her tool bag, even the faint citrus scent she carried. "Good morning," she said warmly. David grinned. "Sound game?" "Better," Isabella whispered. "A new game. But you both have a word to use whenever you want the game to end. That word is stop. Understand?" Daniel nodded solemnly. "Stop means we're in charge?" "Yes," she replied, her throat tightening at his words. You're always in charge of your own comfort. The boys settled into their chairs, their small hands clasped together. Isabella went to the window and opened the curtain just a hair, no wider than a pencil. A beam of soft light fell onto the carpet. "Ready?" she asked. "Yes," they chorused. The thread of light cut through the room. Both heads turned toward it at once, almost instinctively. Isabella timed the reaction with her phone, pressing the button as soon as the slit opened. 480 milliseconds. She jotted it down. Then she stepped into the beam, blocking half of it with her body. "It's darker now," Daniel said softly. "Someone's in the way," David added, excitement bubbling in his voice. Isabella wrote accurate response, latency 500-600 ms, anxiety level 1, low. Her heart soared, but her face remained steady, calm, protective. She could not let them see how much it shook her. "Good job," she whispered. "Do you want to continue?" "Yes," David exclaimed. "Okay," Isabella said gently. "But remember, if you get tired, you say stop." They practiced again. Light, shadow, light again. Every response was precise. Every movement she made, they tracked like flowers turning toward the sun. Once Daniel hesitated, his brow furrowed. "Stop," he whispered. And Isabella froze immediately. She stepped away, closed the curtain, crouched to his level. "Perfect," she said. "You used your word. That's exactly what it's for." For the first time in years, Daniel smiled without sadness in it. From the doorway, Alexander watched. He hadn't entered, afraid he would break the delicate miracle unfolding before his eyes. But his chest rose and fell with unsteady breaths. He had spent fortunes chasing light for his sons, yet here it was, blooming in the hands of a maid armed only with patience and a notebook. Later, when the boys were back upstairs with their toys, Alexander stepped into the room. Isabella was still writing, her notebook filled with times and numbers, every line exact. He picked it up carefully, his fingers trembling as though holding scripture. "You're logging everything?" he asked. "Yes," Isabella said, not looking up. "Every trial, every word they say, every time they choose to stop. Data doesn't lie. If Dr. Collins comes again, he'll have to argue with numbers, not feelings." Alexander's throat tightened. I never thought to do this." His voice faltered, thick with shame. "I was so busy paying for miracles, I forgot to just watch them." Isabella finally looked up, her eyes steady. "Love makes us blind too, Mr. Ward, but it's not too late. What matters is what you choose to see now." He set the notebook down, his gaze burning into hers. For the first time since she had entered his home, he didn't see her as the help. He saw her as something else entirely. A partner, maybe even a lifeline. Above them, a burst of laughter floated down from the twins' room, light, unguarded, and free. Alexander's lips trembled into a smile. He hadn't heard that sound in 7 long years. But downstairs on the kitchen counter, Martha's phone buzzed. A new message flashed across the screen. "Collins, gather evidence. She's overstepping. We'll shut this down." The war had begun. By the end of the week, the penthouse no longer felt like the same tomb it had been. Laughter returned in cautious bursts. The boys no longer rocked themselves endlessly in silence. They leaned forward, asking Isabella for one more game. Each beam of light was measured, each shadow recorded, each moment written into her growing notebook. Alexander found himself drawn to her notes late at night, his fingers running over the numbers as though they were stock charts. But these were worth more than any market gain. These were proof that his sons' lives were not trapped in permanent darkness. It should have been a victory. Instead, it became a weapon. On a gray Tuesday morning, as Isabella prepared her supplies, Celia walked in pale-faced, a tablet in hand. "You should see this," she whispered. The headline screamed across the screen, "Millionaire's children subjected to dangerous experiments by Maid." Underneath, blurry photos stolen somehow from inside the penthouse showed Isabella crouched by the boys, her hand near the curtain, a shaft of light cutting across the carpet. The captions twisted everything. "Unlicensed maid interferes with children's care. Reckless exposure to light may cause trauma. Experts warn of false hope." Alexander's face went cold as he read. His name was sprinkled throughout the article. painted as a desperate father manipulated by an untrained domestic worker. The piece quoted Dr. Collins without naming him directly, using phrases like sources close to the family's car, a team, and a leading ophthalmologist warns. Martha lingered near the doorway, arms crossed. "I warned you this would happen," she said tightly. "You should have left things to the professionals." Alexander turned on her, fury flaring in his eyes. "Professionals told me my children would never see. Yesterday my son told me when it grew darker. That is more truth than Collins has ever given me." Martha shrank back, lips pressed tight, but said nothing more. Isabella remained silent at first, her hands steady on her notebook, though her pulse thundered in her ears. She had lived long enough to know how the world could turn against women like her. Black, working class, invisible until someone needed a scapegoat. She had expected suspicion from Collins, but seeing her face twisted into a villain's mask on a national platform made her chest ache. "I don't read lies," she said softly, finally looking up. "But you should know, this won't stop with one article. They'll push harder. They'll try to bury us in words until the truth can't breathe." Alexander's jaw set, his voice like steel. "Then we fight with evidence, with truth. They can smear a Maid. They cannot erase numbers." That night the damage spread. The story reached talk shows and social feeds. Comment sections overflowed with cruelty. "Keep the help in their lane. What's next, TikTok medicine?" Ward's lost his mind. Upstairs, Daniel and David didn't know the storm raging outside their walls. They only knew that when Isabella walked into their room, they felt safe. She whispered to them, "Do you want to play the light game?" And they smiled, eager. They leaned toward the beam, called out brighter, whispered darker, and once Daniel even said, "Stop," with a mischievous grin just to test her. She stopped instantly, and he giggled. Their world was still small, but it was opening. When Alexander came aside and saw them laughing, a sound caught in his chest. He sank into a chair, covering his face with his hands. For years, he had paid for silence, for experts, for sterile rules. Now, with one woman's persistence, he was hearing what he had thought was lost forever. The knock at the door that evening broke the fragile peace. Two men in suits stood in the hallway, badges clipped to their jackets. State Medical Board, they said. A complaint had been filed. They needed to investigate reports of unlicensed medical activity and risk to minors. Celia gasped. Martha's lips curved in something dangerously close to satisfaction. Isabella didn't flinch. She stepped forward with her notebook clutched tight. "We have nothing to hide," she said, her voice calm. "Come and see." Alexander looked at her then, really looked. In her calm, he saw more courage than he'd ever found in any boardroom. And in that moment, he knew this was no longer just about his children's sight. This was about dignity, truth, and whether the world would listen to the hands that held the light. The board's hearing room smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper, a place where lives were weighed in ink and signatures. The long table gleamed under harsh fluorescent lights stacked with folders, laptops, and nameplates. Behind it sat three officials, their faces carved into professional neutrality. At the far end, a digital recorder blinked red, capturing every word. Alexander sat rigid in a tailored suit, but his hands betrayed him, clenched tight, knuckles pale. Beside him, Isabella straightened her shoulders, her notebook in front of her like armor. Her sneakers looked out of place against the polished floor, yet her presence filled the room with quiet gravity. At her side, Daniel and David perched nervously in their chairs, small hands gripping each other. Their hair was neatly combed, their shirts buttoned, but their blind eyes gave them away, eyes clouded, searching, too young to be trapped in so much judgment. Across from them, Dr. Henry Collins reclined with the confidence of a man who had built his career on authority. His silver hair caught the light, his expensive pen clicked against the table, his attorney whispering at his ear. Every detail about him screamed untouchable. The chairwoman, Dr. Patel, cleared her throat. "We are here to investigate a complaint regarding unlicensed medical activity in the Ward household and potential risk to minors." Her eyes moved from Collins to Isabella. "We will hear from all parties. Dr. Collins, you may begin." Collins rose with practiced grace. "These children were diagnosed by a team of specialists as totally blind. That diagnosis has stood for 7 years. What we are seeing now are dangerous claims made by an untrained individual, a maid no less, who has no qualifications to interfere with therapy. Children with cortical blindness often display random head movements. Parents, desperate for hope, misinterpret these as signs of vision. This is classic false hope, and false hope is cruel. The words landed like darts. Alexander stiffened, fury rising, but Isabella laid a calming hand on his arm. She rose slowly, every movement deliberate, and turned toward the officials. "I don't pretend to be a doctor," she said, her voice low but clear, "but I do know how to listen. I kept records of every response. Light, shadow, brighter, darker. I let the children say stop whenever they wanted. They always had control, and I logged it. Times, latencies, conditions. It's here." She slid her notebook across the table. "It's not opinion, it's observation." One of the board members flipped through the pages. Each line was precise, dated, detailed, his brow furrowed. Dr. Patel looked at the twins. "Daniel, David, would you be comfortable showing us what you've been doing at home?" The boys hesitated, fingers tightening around each other's. Isabella crouched down to their level, whispering, "Only if you want. Remember, you can always say stop." David lifted his chin. "We can do it." A curtain at the side of the room was drawn slightly open, letting in a narrow line of light. Isabella positioned them carefully. "Tell us what you notice," she said softly. The beam spilled across the floor. Both boys turned their faces toward it almost instantly. "It's brighter," Daniel whispered. Isabella stepped into the beam, blocking half. "It's darker now," David said firmly. A hush fell across the room. Even the officials leaned forward, eyes widening. Collins shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "Coincidence," he snapped. "Children can guess." But Isabella repeated the trial, varying the timing. Again and again, the boys responded correctly. The latency was steady, their voices sure. At one point, Daniel rubbed his eyes and whispered, "Stop." Isabella immediately closed the curtain and crouched beside him. "You see," she said gently, "they choose. They are never forced." The silence stretched until Dr. Patel spoke again. "Dr. Collins, these responses do not appear random. How do you explain them?" Collins's polished calm cracked. This is misleading. They are not seeing. At best, they're sensing brightness inconsistencies. It changes nothing." But the board member holding Isabella's notebook tapped a finger against the page. "Doctor, your own neonatal notes flagged possible light perception. Why was that not followed up?" Collins froze, his attorney whispering frantically. His eyes darted from the officials to Alexander, to Isabella, to the children still smiling faintly as though they had just won a secret game. For the first time, Alexander leaned forward, his voice raw, trembling but powerful. "For 7 years, you told me my children lived in complete darkness. Today, they turn their faces to the sun. That is more truth than every one of your reports combined, and I will not let you take it away from them." The room went silent. The officials exchanged glances, their pens moving across papers. Collins sat rigid, his polished certainty stripped away, while Isabella rested her hands lightly on the twins' shoulders. The battle wasn't over, but in that moment, the tide had shifted. The storm outside the boardroom hit faster than Alexander expected. By the next morning, the story had exploded across every media outlet in New York. One network led with a polished anchor's solemn tone. Questions arise as billionaire Alexander Ward's blind children are exposed to untested routines under the guidance of a household maid. The word maid dripped like poison, repeated on headline crawls, on talk shows, on gossip columns. Clips of Isabella with the boys, short, stolen seconds taken out of context, looped endlessly online. She crouched beside them, her hand near the curtain, a narrow beam of light spilling in, but the captions stripped away the truth. "Unlicensed woman conducts experiments." They never showed the notebook, the consent, the way the boys whispered stop and she stopped. Alexander watched the coverage from his study, his fists trembling around a glass of water. For decades he had been painted as ruthless, cold, a machine of numbers and mergers. He had never cared what the world said. But now their words cut into his sons, into Isabella, into the fragile miracle that had just begun to bloom. Isabella, on the other hand, sat calmly at the kitchen table with her notebook open, logging times and conditions from that morning's session. Her hands moved steadily, though her eyes betrayed fatigue. She was used to being underestimated. She had worn those labels her entire life. The help, the maid, people like you. But the idea that the twins could lose their progress because of prejudice made her blood run cold. At noon, the elevator chimed. Celia ushered in a woman in a dark blazer and tight curls, her presence radiating resolve. "Mr. Ward," she said firmly, "I'm Ava Reynolds, civil rights attorney. I've reviewed the complaint and the coverage. What's happening here isn't just about medicine, it's about dignity. And if you're ready, we'll fight this on both fronts, legal and public." Alexander shook her hand, his grip tighter than usual. "I'm ready. I won't let them erase what I've seen with my own eyes." That evening, they gathered in the family room. Ava, Alexander, Isabella, and the twins who sat cross-legged on the rug, giggling as they clapped through another rhythm game. Ava watched quietly, her eyes softening. She wasn't a scientist, but even she could see it. When Isabella opened the curtain just a crack, the boys turned toward it like sunflowers finding the dawn. "Document everything," Ava said. "We'll build a wall of evidence so high they can't climb over it. Videos, charts, logs. And if Collins drags you through the mud, we'll show the world exactly what's happening in this room." But Collins wasn't waiting idly. By midnight, a new article spread like wildfire. Anonymous experts warned of psychological harm. Words like reckless, manipulative, and dangerous splashed across front pages. A distorted voice recording aired on a late-night program. Parents often imagine progress where there is none. The implication was clear. Isabella was a frau, Alexander a fool, the twins victims of delusion. When Alexander saw the headline, "Reckless Maid Endangers Ward Twins," glowing on his phone screen, something inside him snapped. He rose from his chair, stormed into the kitchen where Isabella sat, still scribbling notes under the warm glow of the lamp. "They're calling you names," he said, his voice breaking. They're trying to destroy you." Isabella looked up, her eyes calm but fierce. "They're not just calling me names, Mr. Ward. They're telling your boys they don't matter, that their voices aren't real. But you and I, we know what we saw, and tomorrow we'll show them again. Data doesn't bow to prejudice. It speaks louder." Alexander stared at her, and for the first time in years, something like pride swelled in his chest. Not for his company, not for his fortune, but for the courage sitting across the table in worn sneakers and a white shirt. Upstairs, Daniel's small voice echoed down the stairwell, carrying into the silence. "Miss Isabella?" She closed her notebook and hurried to his room. He was sitting up in bed, his brother's hand clutched tightly. "Will they stop us?" he whispered. Isabella knelt beside him, smoothing his hair. "No one can take away what you already felt. The light is yours now, and we'll keep walking toward it, step by step, together." The boy relaxed, his breathing steadying as he drifted back to sleep. Isabella sat there a long time, watching over them like a sentinel. Downstairs, Alexander typed a short statement for the press. His fingers paused over the final line. Then he wrote, "My sons are not experiments. They are children, and they are finding light. Anyone who tries to silence them will answer to me." He hit send. The war had begun in earnest. The courthouse was packed like a theater the morning of the hearing. Reporters clustered on the steps, their cameras flashing, their questions slicing the air. "Mr. Ward, is it true you're letting a maid experiment on your children? Miss Johnson, are you qualified to conduct medical routines?" Security held them back, but their words struck like stones. Inside, the air was cooler but no less tense. The chamber was grand. Dark wood walls, high ceilings, a gavel that seemed to hold the weight of centuries. At one table sat Alexander Ward, jaw tight, his son's names echoing silently in his chest. Beside him, Isabella sat upright, her hands folded calmly over her notebook. Her worn sneakers looked almost defiant against the polished floor. Ava Reynolds, their attorney, arranged files with razor precision, while Malik Carter, her litigation partner, whispered strategies under his breath. Across the aisle, Dr. Henry Collins leaned back in his chair, his silver hair immaculate, his lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. His lawyer adjusted papers dramatically, ensuring every eye in the room registered the weight of their credentials. Collins looked at Isabella once, briefly, and the contempt in his eyes was colder than steel. The judge, an older man with silver-rimmed glasses, struck the gavel. This court convenes to consider allegations of unlicensed medical practices and the safety of minors in the Ward household. Collins's lawyer rose first, his voice rich and commanding. Your Honor, this case is simple. 2 children, tragically blind since birth, are being subjected to untested, unapproved routines led not by a doctor, not by a therapist, but by a maid. What we have here is not treatment, it is recklessness, and it risks irreparable psychological harm. The words maid and reckless echoed through the room, landing heavy. Alexander's knuckles whitened against the table, but Isabella didn't move, her face serene, her focus sharp. Ava rose next, her tone cutting like glass. Your Honor, what we have here is not recklessness, it is listening. What Miss Johnson has done, carefully, gently, with full consent, is document the undeniable. These children, long dismissed as hopeless, respond to light and shadow. That is not false hope. That is evidence. The judge tilted his head. Evidence, counsel? Ava nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And we have it documented, logged, and corroborated. She signaled to Isabella. Isabella stood. For a moment, the room seemed to hush around her. She held her notebook in both hands, her voice low but steady. I am not a doctor. I am a caretaker, but I know how to observe. Every session, I wrote the time, the light condition, the children's words, brighter, darker, stop. Every time they chose to stop, I stopped. No forcing, no harm, just respect. Collins scoffed, his lawyer jumping in. Your Honor, this is anecdote at best. Random head turns dressed up as science. Children parrot what adults want to hear. Ava stepped forward, eyes blazing. Then let us show you. She gestured toward the back where Daniel and David sat nervously with Celia. Their small hands clutched each other, but when Isabella knelt beside them, they relaxed instantly. Do you want to play our game? She whispered. Daniel nodded. David whispered, yes. At the judge's nod, the bailiff drew a curtain open just an inch, letting a narrow shaft of sunlight cut across the floor. Isabella crouched with them, her hand hovering. Tell me what you feel, she said softly. Almost instantly, both boys turned toward the light. It's brighter, Daniel murmured. Isabella stepped into the beam, blocking it halfway. It's darker, David said firmly. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge leaned forward, his eyes sharp. Repeat the test, he ordered. They did. Again and again, the boys responded correctly, their small voices sure, their faces alive with concentration. At one point, Daniel rubbed his eyes and whispered, stop. Isabella closed the curtain immediately, crouched beside him, and praised, good job using your word. The courtroom fell silent. Collins' lawyer sputtered. Coincidence. It proves nothing. Ava raised her voice over him. Coincidence does not repeat with such precision, Your Honor. And this, she held up Isabella's notebook thick with data, is more rigorous than the reports that wrote these children off for life. The judge looked at Collins. Doctor, can you explain why your own neonatal notes flagged possible light perception, yet no follow-up was ever conducted? For the first time, Collins faltered. His polished calm cracked, his mouth opening but no words forming. His lawyer scrambled to object, but the damage was done. Alexander rose, his voice trembling but fierce. For 7 years I trusted the experts. I sealed my home in darkness because I believed them. And yet, my sons have shown me with their own voices that there is more. You told me never to hope, but I will not let my children live by your limits anymore. The chamber went still. When the gavel finally struck, the judge's ruling came swift and sharp. The court finds no evidence of harm. Home routines may continue under medical supervision. Furthermore, We recommend a review of Dr. Collins's practices regarding the dismissal of light perception in pediatric cases. Collins's face went pale, his hands gripping the table. Isabella closed her notebook, her expression calm but her eyes burning with quiet triumph. Outside, cameras swarmed the courthouse steps. The headlines would rage again, but inside that chamber for the first time, the truth had spoken louder than prejudice, and the battle was far from over. The courthouse steps were a frenzy of cameras, microphones, and questions hurled like stones. Reporters show muted, flashbulbs blinded, and Alexander shielded his sons as Celia ushered them quickly into the waiting car. Isabella lingered for just a second too long, long enough to hear the word hissed from a cluster of voices. Maid, reckless, untrained. She felt the weight of those words pressing against her chest, heavy as chains. But inside the courthouse, a storm even greater was about to break. Back in the hearing chamber, Ava Reynolds spread out a fresh set of documents on the polished oak table. Her voice was calm, measured, but carried a weight that made everyone lean in. Your Honor, before this session closes, we have newly obtained evidence relevant to Dr. Collins's practices. A whistleblower, Olivia Park, a nurse formerly employed at Collins Vision Institute, has come forward. She has provided audit logs and internal communications. Collins stiffened in his seat, his silver hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, his composure cracking just slightly. His attorney whispered furiously at his ear, but the judge raised a hand. Proceed. Ava clicked a remote and the screen at the front lit up with a simple chart. Audit logs, lines of time-stamped entries, each one recording who altered what in the children's medical files. Here, Ava said, her finger tracing the screen. Neonatal notes, March 21st, possible light perception to be investigated, recorded by attending physician. 3 weeks later, March 28th, user ID H. Collins edits the assessment. The phrase possible light perception is deleted. The diagnosis is changed to total cortical blindness. The room went utterly silent. Even the scratch of pens ceased. Collins' attorney leapt to his feet. Your Honor, these logs are technical, easily misinterpreted, but Ava cut him off, voice like steel. There is nothing to misinterpret. The audit log is the hospital's memory. It does not forget. It shows exactly who pressed the keys. Dr. Collins deliberately erased evidence that these children might see light. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Isabella sat frozen, her heart pounding, while Alexander's fists clenched so tight the veins in his arms stood out like cords. Furthermore, Ava continued, clicking again, internal emails, subject line LP flags, parent communications policy, message from supervisor copied to Dr. Collins, quote, do not confuse parents with LP, keep it simple, use total diagnosis. The judge's face darkened. Dr. Collins, do you deny sending or receiving these communications? Collins shifted, his polished veneer slipping. Medicine is complicated, Your Honor. Parents need clarity. Telling them about faint, unconfirmed signals is not your choice to erase, the judge snapped. His gavel struck once, sharp as thunder. At that moment, Olivia Park herself entered, her hands trembling but her voice firm. Your Honor, I worked in that unit. I saw children like Daniel and David flinch under harsh lights. We could have given them gentle light schedules, the kind Miss Johnson uses, but we were told not to. We were told not to complicate. The courtroom erupted. Collins' face drained of color, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For years he had stood unchallenged, a titan of authority. Now, in front of the world, his empire of certainty crumbled under the weight of a notebook, a slit of light, and a whistleblower's courage. The judge's ruling was decisive. This court finds Dr. Henry Collins liable for negligent misdiagnosis and deliberate suppression of evidence. His license will be suspended pending further investigation. Furthermore, the court issues orders for immediate reform. All pediatric blindness diagnoses must include independent review when light perception is flagged. No absolutes where doubt remains, and training for all clinicians and caregiver collaboration. Alexander closed his eyes, a tear sliding down his cheek. Isabella bowed her head, not in triumph, but in relief so deep it felt like her body could finally exhale after weeks of holding its breath. But the moment that would linger forever came after the gavel fell. Reporters crowded the hallway, mics thrust forward, questions flying. One asked the question everyone else was too afraid to voice. "Miss Johnson, how does it feel to be just a maid who proved the experts wrong?" Isabella stood tall, her voice calm, steady, ringing like a bell in the crowded hall. "I'm not just a maid. I am a caretaker, a listener, a recorder. Titles don't move children's eyes toward the sun. Light does. And when children say stop, respect does. I didn't prove anyone wrong. Daniel and David did. All I did was open the curtain." The hallway fell silent, then applause broke. Soft at first, then swelling. That night, back at the penthouse, the curtains were drawn thin. The twins sat on the rug, their small fingers tracing the outlines of the sun puddles spilling onto the floor. David laughed, pointing. "Look, the sun is dancing." Daniel clapped, whispering, "It's brighter." Alexander stood in the doorway, his throat too tight to speak. He turned to Isabella, his voice breaking. "You didn't just give them light. You gave me back my family." Isabella closed her notebook, tears glistening in her eyes. "No," she whispered. "They found it themselves. All I did was show them the way." And as the boys giggled in the glow of a world they had been told they would never know, the truth settled over that house like dawn. Wealth had failed, authority had failed, but courage, patience, and respect, those had cracked the darkness. The Millionaire's twins no longer lived in a house of shadows. They lived in a home where light, gentle, steady, and real, would never be shut out again.